The year was 1913. In a small village lost to time, where cobblestone streets wound like forgotten veins through foggy fields, life moved slowly. The air was thick with the scent of coal smoke and damp earth. At first glance, everything seemed ordinary. Children ran through alleys, dogs barked at passing carts, and families went about their lives, unaware of the shadows that lingered just out of sight. But in one unremarkable home, a moment was captured that would haunt generations to come. A photograph, taken that year, shows children gathered in the afternoon sunlight. They smile, innocent, carefree, joyous. Yet look closer. Something in the image does not belong. Something the children should not have been near. Something that, even in stillness, seems aware. At first, the photograph seemed like a simple memory frozen in time, a cheerful group of children playing outside. But hidden in the shadows, in the edges of the frame, was something sinister. A dark shape half hidden behind a tree. A blurred figure in the doorway. An object, or presence, that no one could explain. Even the photographer, whose hand trembled as he developed the image, admitted that he had felt a chill when taking the picture. A fleeting awareness that this was no ordinary day, no ordinary gathering. The children themselves were a strange lot. Their smiles seemed rehearsed, almost too perfect, as if they knew something the adults did not. Whispers of eerie details began to surface, how one child spoke in a forbidden language, words that no parent could recognize, yet carried a weight of warning. Another child held a small, unidentifiable object, their eyes darting nervously toward the doorway. Their families were quiet, secretive. Old records hint at strange families in this village, whose histories were riddled with vanished children, whispered curses, and connections to places that locals called haunted. This photograph was discovered decades later in a forgotten album, tucked between post-mortem photography and other disturbing images. The album had been abandoned in a locked chest, lost in time, as if someone had tried to bury the memory itself. But photographs, like memories, have a stubborn persistence. They survive, quietly waiting to reveal truths that were never meant to be uncovered. Historians who first examined the photograph noted the unsettling composition. The children's shadows fall unnaturally. The smiles, frozen in the chemical capture of the old photo, seem too precise, almost mocking. And behind them, barely perceptible, lies the object of curiosity and dread. Scholars speculated, a relic from a forgotten ritual? Evidence of a mysterious disappearance? A witness to something that defies explanation? No records could confirm the nature of what lurked there. Only the photograph remained, unblinking, silent, accusing. The village itself had a history that added to the unease. Records describe an unsettling past, families lost in time, homes abandoned with meals left uneaten, and streets that would echo with laughter late at night, though no one was there. Children disappeared, sometimes for days, sometimes never to return. Locals spoke in hushed tones of forbidden languages, voices that should not exist in human mouths. Stories of haunted places and chilling secrets were commonplace, yet authorities dismissed them as folklore. And yet, in that photograph, all of these horrors seem to converge. Post-mortem photography, common in this era, shows how society tried to preserve what was lost. But this image was different. It was alive, in a way photographs rarely are. The children smiled, yes, but not just at the camera. They smiled beside something ancient, something that perhaps should not have been seen. And because of that, the photograph would become a cornerstone of dark history, a haunting artifact of unsolved mysteries, forgotten events, and disturbing images that continue to unsettle. Look closely at the photograph. Notice the small details. The tilt of a head, the angle of a hand, the faint shadow that shouldn't exist in natural light. These are not mistakes. These are echoes of a sinister past. They are glimpses of hidden truth, long buried beneath time and secrecy. And so, what began as a simple photograph, a fragment of a seemingly ordinary day in 1913, unfolds into a story of vanished children, strange families, and a mysterious presence captured forever in silver halide. What were the children smiling at? Why did the photographer feel a chill? And most importantly, what was it that they should not have seen? Nestled in the rolling hills and misted valleys of the countryside lay a village that time seemed to have abandoned. Streets wound like forgotten veins between moss-covered cottages, their wooden shutters sagging and paint flaking with decades of neglect. The air was always damp, carrying a faint odor of wet earth and smoke from chimneys long extinguished. Locals, when asked about the village's past, spoke in hushed tones, as though saying its name too loudly might awaken something that should remain asleep. The village had never been large, but it had a peculiar rhythm, a rhythm of life that was punctuated by strange events no outsider could understand. Children played along cobbled lanes, yet some families would lock doors and whisper warnings as though the very air carried secrets. It was a place where the ordinary and the extraordinary intertwined, where laughter could mask fear and smiles could hide unspeakable truths. In the days leading up to the photograph, there were rumors, soft, almost imperceptible, that something was wrong. Villagers spoke of fleeting shadows at dusk, shapes moving just beyond the lamplight, and the distant wail of a child that could not be found. Some claimed that the forest bordering the village was alive with voices in a forbidden language, a tongue that belonged neither to the living nor the dead. Few dared to enter, and fewer returned unchanged. Even the older families, whose lineages stretched back generations, seemed reluctant to speak. The village, it seemed, held on to its secrets tightly, letting only glimpses of them escape through whispered stories and hushed confessions. Look closely at the streets in the old photographs of the village. At first glance, they appear idyllic. Cobblestones slick with rain, children chasing one another in the square, merchants tending their stalls. But in the shadows of the corners, just behind a shuttered window or beneath an archway, something watches, something waits. Scholars who later studied these photographs noted that certain figures appear where no one should be, blurred shapes that vanish upon closer inspection, but leave a trace of unease that lingers in the viewer's mind. These were not accidents of exposure or poor development. They were remnants of forgotten events, captured quietly by the lens, immortalizing the unsettling history that no one dared to document openly. The village's families carried histories that were as eerie as the landscape itself. One family, in particular, lived near the edge of the forest, in a house whose windows were always closed against the wind. Locals whispered that they spoke a forbidden language and kept strange rituals in the dead of night. Others said their children could vanish for hours, sometimes days, and return changed, speaking of things no human should witness. Though much of this was dismissed as superstition, the old letters, journals, and even a few preserved photographs hint at a more sinister past. Hidden truths of vanished children, chilling secrets passed from one generation to the next, and a presence in the village that was patient, observant, and unseen. At the time the photograph was taken, the village was quiet in the way only forgotten places can be quiet. Windows were open to let in light, yet the rooms remained cold and shadowed. Dogs lay in the corners of streets, but seemed to sense something no human could. The church bell tolled late in the afternoon, but the sound was hollow, echoing against walls that had long since forgotten voices. It was in this suspended silence that the children gathered, unaware, or perhaps fully aware, of what lay just beyond the frame of the camera. There are records, scant and fragmented, of odd occurrences in the village around that period. A child found staring into a well for hours, unable to speak. A doorway that led to a room no one had built. Footsteps on the roof when the house was empty. Small details at first dismissed, but over time, patterns emerged. Something lingered in the spaces between daily life and memory, and it seemed to have a particular interest in the children. Even the landscape itself seemed complicit. Trees twisted unnaturally toward the village paths, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. Fog rolled in without warning, thick and impenetrable, swallowing cottages and fields alike. Some believed the village existed in a kind of liminal space, a place between the living and the forgotten, where history itself could not decide what should remain visible and what should be lost in time. The photograph, when it re-emerged decades later, captured all of this in a single frame. Children smiling in a sunlit yard, oblivious to the eerie surroundings. The village, though distant in memory, was unmistakably present. Its sinister past, its hidden truths, its forgotten events, all lay quietly in the photograph, waiting for the eyes brave enough to see them. And yet, no matter how many times one looked, there remained details that could not be explained. A shadow that did not belong to any child. A slight distortion near the edge of the frame. An expression on one of the children's faces that hinted at knowledge far beyond their years. The village had allowed the camera to capture more than a moment of innocent joy. It had revealed the intersection of life and something far older, something lost in time. Look closely at the children in the photograph. At first, they appear ordinary, young faces lit by sunlight, dresses and jackets carefully arranged, hair brushed neatly, smiles wide and bright. They could be siblings, cousins, or neighbors simply enjoying an afternoon. But there is something off, something subtle that the camera, with its indifferent eye, captured and preserved forever. The children, though smiling, carry expressions that do not belong entirely to innocence. Their eyes are too alert, too focused, as if they see something beyond the edges of the frame. Some glance not at the camera, but just past it, towards something invisible to us. Their postures are stiff, rehearsed, almost ceremonial, like children caught mid-gesture in a game they do not fully understand, but a game with rules older than any of them. Histories of their families add weight to these eerie details. One boy, thin and pale, came from a lineage long whispered about in the village. Letters, diaries, and local accounts hint at strange behaviors. Speaking in forbidden words no adult could comprehend, muttering phrases from languages thought to have been lost to time. His mother wrote in a private journal that he often stared at objects no one else could see, pointing and laughing at shapes that vanished when anyone approached. The girls in the photo were no less unusual. One wore a necklace of small, carved symbols, symbols whose meaning was not recorded anywhere, but hinted at ritual or warning. Another carried a small box in her hands, held tightly to her chest, refusing to open it even for a photograph. Villagers would later recall seeing children wandering alone near the forest at dusk, whispering to invisible companions, repeating the same phrases over and over, voices soft yet carrying an unnatural cadence. These details, lost in time, only emerge when one studies the photograph carefully. Post-mortem photography was common in this era, and while many families treated images as simple mementos, this photograph seemed to capture more than mere memory. It recorded presence. Not just the children, but the unseen, the object, the shadow, the something behind them that the children acknowledged without fear. Some historians describe it as a moment where the living and the inexplicable brushed against each other, leaving a residue of unease embedded in silver halide. The children's interactions are curious. At first glance, they smile in unison, but subtle gestures betray tension. A hand clutches another hand too tightly. A foot hovers, ready to step back. Eyes glance toward the periphery, darting as though sensing the gaze of a hidden observer. Scholars examining old photographs of vanished children note these minute behaviors as significant. Children, unlike adults, rarely mask fear with such perfection. Yet in this image, the smiles persist. A knowledge, perhaps, that they are meant to appear happy while something unspeakable lurks nearby. Local records, scarce and fragmentary, hint at the children's fate in the days after the photograph was taken. One disappeared for 3 days, returning with a blank stare and refusing to speak of where she had been. Another fell gravely ill, though no doctor could diagnose the cause. Even decades later, descendants of these families would speak of strange dreams, of small voices reciting a forbidden language in empty rooms. It is as if the photograph itself held a kind of power, a bridge between moments, a record of something that should not have been seen. Look closely at the composition. The children's smiles are mirrors, reflecting not innocence, but complicity. Complicity in acknowledging a presence that adults could neither see nor understand. Shadows bend toward them unnaturally. Light seems drawn away from the corners of the frame, leaving only the children and the object of curiosity in sharp focus. It is not merely a photograph. It is a record of attention, of awareness. And the attention is not entirely theirs. Even today, those who study the image cannot agree on what the children were witnessing. Some claim it is an object, ancient and wooden, partially hidden in the sunlit yard. Others argue it is a figure, blurred, indistinct, but unmistakably humanoid. A few believe it was something far stranger, an echo of a presence from a world beyond our own. The children's expressions suggest they knew it, understood it, or perhaps had been instructed to ignore it. And that knowledge, so carefully maintained in their smiles, is what continues to unsettle viewers over a century later. Families in the village were aware, in their own muted way, of the unnatural events surrounding the children. Letters mention the look in their eyes, and things said at night that should not be remembered. Some parents tried to intervene, forbidding children from wandering alone, from speaking certain words, from entering particular rooms. Others, perhaps aware that the veil between life and something darker was thin, did nothing, letting the children remain part of a mystery they could not hope to understand. And so the photograph survives, carrying with it the combined weight of innocence and knowledge, of light and shadow. It is a frozen record of children smiling beside something they should not have seen. It preserves, with unerring accuracy, every nuance of posture, every twitch of expression, every fleeting glance toward the unseen. For those who look long enough, the unsettling truth becomes clear. These smiles are not ordinary. They are part of the story itself, part of the dark history the village tried to hide, part of a lingering mystery that refuses to be explained. At the center of the photograph, behind the cluster of smiling children, lies the object that has puzzled historians, investigators, and horror enthusiasts for over a century. At first glance, it appears insignificant, a wooden crate, a small pile of tools, or perhaps an oddly shaped piece of furniture. But hidden in the shadows, partially obscured by the children's bodies, there is a strange angle, a curve, a dark stain that does not belong to the natural world. Something about it is wrong. The villagers who lived near the scene of the photograph never spoke openly about the object. It was always a whispered topic, mentioned only in corners, in tones that suggested fear and reverence. Some believed it was a remnant of old rituals, something left by families long gone, whose practices had been considered disturbing even for that time. Others speculated it was a container of knowledge, a chest holding symbols or objects from a forbidden past. And there were those who thought it was alive, or at least infused with a presence that could observe, influence, and manipulate without being seen. Photographic experts examining the image note that the object casts a shadow inconsistent with the sunlight falling on the children. It appears darker than physics should allow, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Some suggest it may have been moved at the moment of exposure, a slight tremor that left it unnaturally blurred, yet precise enough to suggest intent. The children's glances toward it indicate awareness, some frightened, some oddly curious, others disturbingly calm. Local legends describe similar objects appearing in other villages, often connected to vanished children or families with secrets too dark to record. These objects were rarely examined, often burned, buried, or hidden away, as if their mere presence invited misfortune. In the village where the photograph was taken, the object remained. It lingered in photographs, in memories, in stories passed down quietly through generations. And like all forbidden things, it demanded attention, even if it could never be fully understood. There are reports, decades after the photograph surfaced, of viewers experiencing unsettling reactions to it. Scholars who studied the image in dimly lit archives reported feelings of unease, headaches, and even fleeting visions of movement within the shadows. Children, in particular, seemed drawn to it, pointing at the photograph and muttering words in languages they could not have learned naturally. Could it be that the object contained some echo of a presence? A remnant of something older, more patient than humans, waiting silently in the frame for those who dared to notice? The composition of the photograph itself provides clues. The children are arranged around the object, yet not randomly. Their positions suggest an unconscious ritual, a pattern of acknowledgement, perhaps even worship. One child crouches slightly, hand hovering above the object as if ready to touch it. but restrained. Another tilts their head, eyes locked on the indistinct form. The photographer, who later admitted feeling an inexplicable chill while taking the picture, could only capture what was visible from his angle. And yet, something seems to reach beyond the frame, beyond the limitations of early 20th century photography. Historians attempting to identify the object have turned to archives, letters, and oral histories. Some believe it may have been an artifact used in a long-forgotten ceremonial practice, something tied to local superstitions about spirits and the afterlife. Others insist it is a mundane object, a crate, a stool, a bundle of cloth, but that the children's behavior around it transforms the ordinary into something profoundly disturbing. Perhaps it is not the object itself, but what it provokes: attention, fear, fascination, and awareness of a hidden truth no adult could fully comprehend. There are subtle details in the photograph that amplify the mystery. The shadow seems to bend unnaturally around the edges of the object, creating angles impossible for sunlight to cast. A dark smudge near the base resembles a hand or claw, though no one was present to make it. Even the texture of the surface seems inconsistent, like the chemical composition of the photograph distorted under stress. Scholars call this anomalous detailing, a term often reserved for post-mortem photography or images linked to haunted places. Yet this object was captured in the open, in a sunlit yard, beside children who should have been too young to notice anything untoward. What makes the object truly unsettling is the reaction of the children themselves. Some historians suggest that their smiles are not simply posed, but forced attempts to mask awareness, fear, or understanding. Others argue the children knew something, and in some unspoken, instinctive way, accepted it. Their gestures, subtle and precise, form a language of acknowledgement, a silent communication with the object that viewers can feel but cannot hear. The object, despite its static form, becomes a focal point for the entire photograph. It embodies the tension between innocence and awareness, childhood and forbidden knowledge. The children's smiles are not simple expressions of joy, they are shields, masks worn to navigate a presence that is patient, enigmatic, and impossibly old. And the longer one looks, the more it seems to watch back, waiting for recognition, demanding acknowledgement, keeping secrets that will never be spoken aloud. Even today, the object remains impossible to identify with certainty. Scholars continue to debate its nature, yet the photograph's power endures. It is a frozen moment, a collision of innocence and horror, of ordinary life and dark history, capturing something lost in time that should never have been seen. After the photograph was taken, the village seemed to change, though no one could explain exactly how. At first, it was subtle, a lingering chill in certain rooms, a faint whisper in the hallways of empty homes, footsteps where none should exist. The children themselves began to act differently. Small details were noticed. One would pause mid-play, staring at nothing, lips moving as though speaking a forbidden language. Another would hold objects close to their chest, muttering words no adult could comprehend. Even the most skeptical parents found themselves unsettled, their instincts warning that something had shifted, something that should not have been disturbed. The whispers began shortly afterward, carried through the village by those who claimed to hear them in the night. Old neighbors swore they could hear voices, soft and fleeting, that seemed to come from the children themselves. Words in that forbidden language, impossible for anyone alive to understand, whispered through the darkened streets. Some villagers reported hearing these voices calling names, repeating phrases that sounded like warnings, or perhaps instructions. But whenever adults approached, the voices ceased. Only the photograph preserved the trace of their presence. Letters from that period, written in hurried script, hint at unease. Parents wrote about objects moving on their own, shadows lingering near the edge of candlelight, and sudden chills in rooms that had been warmed just moments before. One mother described seeing her child staring at a wall, pointing at something invisible, repeating the same phrase over and over. A phrase she could not translate, a phrase that seemed older than the village itself. These accounts were rare, fragmentary, and often dismissed by outsiders as superstition. Yet in the context of the photograph, these whispers take on a darker weight. They are not random. They are part of a pattern, a growing sense that the children were in contact with something older, something patient, something forbidden. The warnings came in other forms as well. Visitors passing through the village reported sudden headaches, nausea, or a feeling of being watched. Dogs would growl at nothing, refusing to enter rooms, or run into the fog for no reason. Even the weather seemed to conspire. Mist would roll in at odd times, suffocating the streets, and sunlight would bend strangely, casting unnatural shadows. It was as if the village itself carried a memory of the day the photograph was taken, an echo of what had been witnessed. Families closest to the children were particularly affected. Some parents tried to intervene, forbidding their children from certain areas of the village, locking doors, or scolding them for odd behavior. Others did nothing, either paralyzed by fear or resigned to the idea that they were powerless against what had been glimpsed. Diaries preserved in the local archives hint at parents secretly observing their children, noting how their eyes would follow invisible shapes, how their smiles could freeze mid-laugh, as if reacting to something outside the human gaze. The photograph itself seemed to amplify the effect. Those who studied it closely reported feelings of unease so strong they could barely look at it for more than a few minutes. Shadows in the image appeared to shift slightly under prolonged scrutiny. Details would emerge that were invisible at first glance, and the children's eyes seemed to follow the viewer across the room. Some historians suggest that the photograph became a conduit, a frozen window through which the whispers and warnings could still reach those sensitive enough to feel them. Accounts from the villagers suggest that warnings were not only auditory but physical. Children who had been in the yard when the photograph was taken began to experience sudden collapses, fainting spells, or long bouts of sleep where they spoke in their forbidden language. Some woke screaming, claiming to have seen figures or objects moving in ways that defied explanation. Adults, desperate to understand, sought advice from neighboring towns, from doctors, from clergy, but none could provide answers. The only constant was the photograph, the children, and the shadows around them. Even decades later, descendants recall family stories that never made it into public records. Tales of fleeting visions, of objects appearing and disappearing in the night, and of children compelled to behave in ways that suggested knowledge of hidden truths. One account tells of a child waking in the middle of the night to draw symbols on the floor in chalk, symbols no adult recognized, but eerily similar to carvings later noted near the edge of the photograph. Another tells of a child who spoke to a shape no one else could see, describing it in words that were both terrifying and precise, a forbidden language of warning that echoed the whispers reported long ago. It is here, in the intersection of observation and speculation, that the village's legacy becomes clear. The photograph did not merely record a moment. It captured an awareness, a connection between children and something beyond ordinary comprehension. Whispers and warnings followed, not as random acts of imagination, but as evidence of an underlying, sinister presence. Forgotten events, vanished children, strange families, and chilling secrets all converge in this single, haunting image, hinting at truths that the human mind struggles to accept. The more one studies the photograph, the more these warnings assert themselves. Shadows bend, whispers echo, and the children's smiles take on an unsettling clarity. They are not smiling at the camera. They are smiling beside something they should not see, something that watches, waits, and whispers still, even after a century has passed. The photograph that would haunt generations did not simply appear. It had a creator. The photographer, a man named Elias Thornwell, was an enigmatic figure in the village. Not much is known of his life before that year. Some say he arrived from the city, camera in hand, carrying an air of quiet obsession. Others recall that he had lived in the area for decades, documenting weddings, funerals, and festivals, yet always keeping a private notebook filled with cryptic observations, sketches, and symbols no one could decipher. Thornwell's presence was both familiar and unsettling. Villagers respected his craft but feared his attention. He was meticulous, never missing a detail, and seemed drawn to moments others considered trivial. Yet there was an edge to him, a subtle intensity in his gaze, a sense that he was always searching, not merely for images, but for something hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life. His studio, tucked behind the main square, was filled with photographs of children, families, and town events, but there was always something unusual. Shadows seemed darker, eyes too knowing, smiles too precise. And there, among the familiar, were images of vanished children, of objects that defied description, and of spaces where reality seemed to bend. The day he captured the photograph of the children beside the mysterious object, Thornwell reportedly felt a chill. He never spoke of it openly, but in private letters discovered decades later, he wrote of a presence in the yard, a gaze he could not explain, a weight in the air that made the shutter tremble in his hands. He described how the children seemed aware of it too, their expressions shifting subtly as though acknowledging something unseen. The camera froze that acknowledgement in time, capturing both innocence and a sinister awareness that would endure far longer than Thornwell himself. Some historians suggest that Thornwell was drawn to more than just photography. His notes reference studies of post-mortem photography, forgotten rituals, and strange families. He seemed fascinated by objects and presences that bridged the living and the unknown. Letters describe how he would spend hours observing children at play, noting patterns in behavior, gestures, and gazes. It is unclear whether he understood what he had captured in the photograph, or if he recognized the object and the presence beside it as something older and far more powerful than he could confront. Thornwell's own life became entwined with the mystery. Friends recall that after the photograph was taken, he grew withdrawn, haunted by something he could neither explain nor escape. He began avoiding the village at night, locking himself in the studio, and speaking rarely to anyone. Some say he attempted to destroy other images, fearing the consequences of exposure. Others claim he became obsessed, returning repeatedly to the site of the photograph, notebook in hand, searching for signs that only he could see. His obsession mirrors the nature of the photograph itself, the pull of the hidden, the allure of the forbidden, the danger of seeing what should remain unseen. There are also accounts of other photographs he took around the same period. One shows a single child standing in a doorway, alone, gazing at something unseen, shadows stretching unnaturally across the floor. Another depicts a family in a dimly lit room, hands clasped together, eyes wide with fear, as if they knew the camera would capture more than they intended. Each image carries the same eerie quality, subtle distortions, unnatural shadows, and an almost imperceptible tension in the subject's expressions. Thornwell was not simply a photographer. He was a chronicler of something the ordinary eye could not comprehend. The children in the 1913 photograph, in particular, seemed to respond to his presence. Some historians argue that his gaze, the act of photographing, awakened or summoned the awareness in them. Others believe he was merely an observer, and the children's recognition of the object beside them was independent of his camera. Either way, the interaction is undeniable. The photograph captures a moment of connection, a silent acknowledgement of something far older, far stranger than the village could contain. Thornwell's studio, now long gone, reportedly contained other items tied to his work. Strange objects, symbols etched into paper, photographs of shadows that seemed to move when observed in sequence. Some researchers believe he was documenting phenomena that straddled the line between life and something beyond, glimpses of dark history, disturbing images, and unsettling truths. Others suggest he may have stumbled onto something he did not understand, an object or presence that had lingered in the village for generations, patiently waiting for witnesses who could perceive it. In the end, Thornwell's own life was marked by the photograph. He left the village shortly afterward, never to return, carrying with him notebooks, prints, and secrets he refused to share. Some say he destroyed many of his works, fearful of the consequences. Yet the photograph of the children smiling beside the mysterious object survived, an artifact of his vision and his fear. It remains, even today, a chilling reminder of what happens when curiosity meets something that should not be seen, and of a man who, in seeking to document life, inadvertently preserved a fragment of the sinister past that haunted the village. Even before the photograph surfaced in public memory, there were whispers of forces at play that no one could explain. The village seemed alive in ways that went unnoticed by the casual observer. Doors would creak open without wind. Footsteps echoed along empty streets at midnight. Shadows moved against the grain of sunlight. At first, these occurrences were subtle, easily dismissed as imagination or coincidence. But over time, patterns emerged, and it became clear that something unseen was observing, influencing, and perhaps even guiding the children. Look closely at the photograph. There is a tension in the air, frozen in silver halide. The children's smiles mask awareness. Their eyes, however, betray something extraordinary. Some glance toward the object in the yard. Others seem to focus beyond it, towards something invisible to the human eye. It is as if the photograph captured not merely a moment in time, but a convergence, a fleeting acknowledgement of forces too powerful to comprehend. Villagers later described experiences that could not be explained rationally. Windows rattled with no storm, doors slammed without cause, and objects appeared in places they had never been. Animals behaved strangely, particularly the village dogs, who would howl at walls or flee in terror, their instincts alert to things humans could not perceive. Some elders spoke of presences in the air, invisible yet undeniably present, that would linger near the children, as if drawn to them, or perhaps guarding them. The children themselves began to display behavior that suggested a connection with these unseen forces. One would stand silently in a corner, eyes following an invisible figure across the room. Another would whisper in a language no parent recognized, uttering words that seemed older than the village, older than memory itself. Some children exhibited uncanny coordination, their movements almost ritualistic, as though guided by unseen hands. Their smiles persisted, but there was a precision to them, a deliberate masking of recognition and fear. Historians and paranormal researchers who studied the photograph noted subtle anomalies. Shadows fell at impossible angles. Light seemed to bend unnaturally around certain objects. Tiny distortions appeared near the edges of the frame, as though reality itself had warped. These were not artifacts of the camera or errors in development. They were the visual echoes of forces that existed outside normal perception, forces that the children, knowingly or unknowingly, had acknowledged. Some accounts suggest that these unseen forces were not inherently malevolent, but deeply inscrutable. They influenced behavior, drew attention, and, in some cases, communicated through the children. Whether the children understood these forces or merely obeyed instinct remains a mystery. Diaries recovered from families decades later hint at children being taught by invisible presences, whispering secrets, predicting events, or repeating the forbidden language they had overheard in the forest or behind closed doors. Observers of the photograph have reported uncanny experiences even in modern times. Viewers describe chills, feelings of being watched, and fleeting glimpses of shapes shifting in peripheral vision. Some claim to hear whispers in their minds when staring too long, echoing the words of the children in the photograph. The more one studies the image, the more the presence becomes palpable. It is as if the photograph serves as a conduit, a frozen channel linking the viewer to the unseen. The village itself, in the months and years after the photograph, bore witness to inexplicable events. Families experienced strange illnesses, objects vanished, and sudden accidents occurred with alarming regularity. Some historians speculate that these were consequences of the forces captured in the image, energies that interacted with the human world but could not be controlled. Others suggest that the children, by acknowledging these forces in their smiles and gestures, had inadvertently invited them into the lives of all who observed them. One particularly chilling report tells of a house near the edge of the village. At night, shadows moved across the walls without light. A child who lived there would speak alone in the dark, repeating phrases from the forbidden language. Visitors reported feeling invisible hands brush against their shoulders, the sensation cold and insistent. This same child appears in the 1913 photograph, smile fixed, eyes alert to forces no one else could perceive. Even today, the photograph continues to provoke unease. Modern analyses reveal subtle anomalies undetectable to the naked eye, faint blurs, impossible angles, and distortions in the shadows surrounding the children and the object. Scholars call them unexplainable phenomena, But the locals, those attuned to the village's whispered history, know better. They recognize the influence of unseen forces, patient and persistent, that reach across decades, watching, waiting, and quietly bending the world to their perception. The children's smiles, in the context of these forces, become more than a mere expression. They are a mask, a shield, and perhaps a signal. They indicate recognition, obedience, or maybe even communication with something beyond the physical realm. The photograph is not simply a record of a moment in time. It is a document of interaction between the living and the hidden, between innocence and something profoundly older, wiser, and darker. The deeper one studies the image, the more these unseen forces assert themselves. Shadows stretch, light bends, and the photograph's subtle distortions seem almost to pulse with a presence that was always there, waiting to be noticed. The children were not merely smiling at the camera. They were acknowledging, consciously or unconsciously, the forces beside them, forces that have lingered in the village long after the photograph was taken, forces that may still watch today. The village's unsettling atmosphere extended far beyond the photograph. It seeped into homes, into families, and into the lives of those who had lived too close to what should have remained unseen. Among the children captured in the image, some came from families whose histories were cloaked in mystery and whispered warnings. These families were not merely eccentric, they were secretive, almost ritualistic, and their behaviors hinted at knowledge of forces that the ordinary mind could not comprehend. Look closely at the photograph again. The children's parents are absent from the frame, yet their presence is felt in the careful arrangement, in the posture and gestures of the children. Families instructed them, guided them, perhaps even protected them from a world the children were only beginning to perceive. Diaries recovered decades later reveal instructions in hushed tones, warnings to never speak certain words, to avoid certain areas, and to pay attention to things invisible to others. These were not ordinary childhood lessons, they were lessons in survival, or perhaps obedience, in the face of forces older than the village itself. One family, whose daughter appears near the center of the photograph, was known for maintaining journals in code, a forbidden language never documented elsewhere. The writings describe phenomena seen by children, shapes in shadows, voices in empty rooms, and objects that moved without human touch. In some passages, the journal warns that the eyes always watch, and smiles are shields. Such statements suggest an understanding that the children themselves were participants in events that transcended ordinary perception. These were not merely witnesses, they were conduits, observers, and sometimes unwitting participants in rituals long forgotten by history. Other families held disturbing traditions. Certain households forbade children from entering specific rooms or going near the forest at night. Some spoke of the silent visitor, a presence known to children but invisible to adults, that demanded acknowledgement. Parents claimed it was protective. Others whispered it was punitive, capable of bending the world in subtle, unsettling ways. Among the children in the photograph, small gestures, clutching an object, tilting a head, a barely perceptible glance toward the shadow, hint at the lessons they had been taught, the precautions ingrained in them from birth. Hidden truths emerge when examining village records. Several children disappeared for hours or days without explanation, returning altered, silent, or speaking fragments of the forbidden language. In some cases, siblings reported seeing these children communicate with figures no one else could perceive. Families rarely documented these events publicly. Instead, notes were hidden in journals, letters, and marginalia, as if recording a history too dangerous to reveal. Post-mortem photography and old portraits sometimes captured odd shadows or distortions, similar to the anomalies in the 1913 photograph. These images suggest that the family's awareness of the unseen extended to both the living and the residual, the echoes of presence preserved in silver and light. One particularly chilling account involves a family whose son appears in the photograph, standing near the mysterious object. Letters describe him whispering to the object in the yard, recounting phrases that the parents could not translate. The child was observed performing gestures, mimicking rituals described in coded journals. He did not smile at the camera that day, yet in the photograph, The faint curve of his lips is visible, a compromise between fear, obedience, and acknowledgement. The family's secrecy shielded them from interference, but the photograph preserved their complicity, making their private understanding public, whether they wished it or not. Other families similarly concealed knowledge. Some carried objects believed to be protective talismans. Others hid charms or symbols in the walls of their homes. Forbidden languages were spoken quietly in the dark, passed from parent to child. Some historians speculate that these practices were not superstition, they were methods of interacting with forces that had been part of the village for generations, forces that left traces in shadows, whispers, and photographs. The children were both observers and instruments of this hidden history, their smiles masking comprehension that adults could neither perceive nor confront. Even decades later, descendants recount stories of eerie behaviors in the household. Objects moved without explanation. Shadows lingered in corners. Children reported voices, sometimes in their dreams, repeating words their ancestors had recorded in journals. Some families attempted to burn or destroy these records, fearing the consequences of exposure. Yet the photograph, surviving intact, preserves the evidence. It is a testament to families whose knowledge bridged the ordinary and the inexplicable, whose secrets intertwined with the vanished children, the unseen forces, and the dark history that pervaded the village. The photograph is more than an image. It is a record of instruction, of obedience, and of concealment. Every gesture, every glance, every smile captured in 1913 carries layers of meaning. The children were not simply playing, they were practicing survival, participating in lessons about hidden forces, and acknowledging realities that most adults could not perceive. The family's secrets are embedded in their posture, their arrangement, and the subtle cues of recognition. The more one studies these details, the clearer it becomes. The photograph is not just a moment frozen in time. It is a ledger of hidden truths, a catalog of chilling secrets, and a document of unsettling history. The family's knowledge, passed quietly through generations, converges in the children's smiles and the shadows around them. Every detail hints at forces that continue to linger, waiting for those willing, or perhaps compelled, to notice. The photograph survived the years, untouched by time yet heavy with the weight of history. The village that had once been the stage for its creation faded from memory, its streets abandoned, its cottages collapsing, moss consuming brick and wood alike. Yet the photograph remained, a frozen testament to events, forces, and secrets that time itself could not erase. The children in the image grew older, scattered by circumstance or fate. Some left the village, carrying with them fragments of knowledge they would never fully explain. Others remained, their lives shaped by the lingering presence they had witnessed. Accounts from descendants suggest that many carried uncanny abilities, heightened intuition, an awareness of things unseen, or the persistent hearing of voices that whispered warnings in a forgotten language. The photograph, now a relic, seemed to preserve the very essence of what they had encountered, as if the moment captured could never truly die. Families that had once been secretive about their knowledge continued to pass it down, carefully, in coded journals and private rituals. The practices became less frequent, less understood, but they never disappeared. Descendants often spoke of objects moving without touch, doors closing on their own, and shadows that lingered longer than light should allow. The legacy of the unseen forces, the family's secrets, and the vanished children endured, quietly woven into the fabric of daily life. Historians and collectors who discovered the photograph decades later were not immune to its effects. Many described a growing sense of unease when observing the children's faces and the object beside them. Shadows in the frame appeared to shift, and subtle distortions seemed to pulse under prolonged scrutiny. Some claimed to hear faint whispers, just on the edge of perception, echoing the forbidden language of the children. The photograph was no longer merely a historical artifact. It had become an active conduit of memory, presence, and fear. Even those who did not know the village or the families reported inexplicable sensations, chills, sudden nausea, or a feeling of being watched when the photograph was displayed. Scholars began to categorize these occurrences under terms like viewer's disturbance, Yet villagers and descendants knew the truth. It was not merely the photograph, but the object, the children, and the unseen forces they acknowledged, all intertwined in a moment too potent to ever fade. The village itself left traces in local folklore. Travelers reported wandering streets that appeared intact for a brief moment, only to vanish into fog. Old maps, updated over decades, sometimes omitted the village entirely, as if cartographers had been warned, or perhaps instinctively erased it from records. Stories of vanished children and haunted homes circulated in whispered legends, the kind of folklore dismissed by outsiders yet deeply resonant with those who remembered. The photograph acted as a bridge, connecting these scattered fragments of history, forgotten events, and unsettling truths into a single, coherent narrative of loss and vigilance. Over time, attempts were made to study the photograph scientifically. Researchers examined light angles, shadows, and chemical composition. Yet the deeper they looked, the more anomalies appeared. Tiny distortions, impossible shadows, faint shapes behind the children. Each discovery raised more questions than it answered. No analysis could account for the object beside the children, nor the peculiar awareness reflected in their eyes. Experts concluded that some aspects of history, some events captured in silver halide, resist rational explanation. Some moments remain, preserved as disturbing images, chilling secrets, and glimpses of forces beyond understanding. Descendants of the village families often recount stories of lingering influence. Some claim that the children, now grown, carried a subtle knowledge of fate and warning, able to sense danger, interpret signs, or avoid events that might seem ordinary to others. One account tells of a woman who, while visiting the site of the original photograph, experienced a vision of the children smiling beside the object, an echo of 1913, as if the past were reaching through time. Other descendants report hearing whispers in dreams, voices repeating fragments of the forbidden language long after the village ceased to exist. The photograph, meanwhile, continued to circulate quietly among collectors and historians, always eliciting fascination and fear. It became a symbol of dark history, of vanished children, of the fragile boundary between innocence and forbidden knowledge. The object in the frame, though still unidentified, continues to captivate. A relic of forgotten events, a focus for the children's awareness, and a silent witness to the unseen forces that shaped their lives. Ultimately, the legacy of the photograph is both cautionary and unsettling. It is a reminder that history is not always benign, that innocence can coexist with awareness of things too dark to describe, and that the forces captured in a single moment can endure long after their witnesses have vanished. Forgotten families, haunted streets, disturbing images, and hidden truths converge in the frame, leaving viewers with more questions than answers. The children's smiles, once a simple display of joy, are now understood as masks, acknowledgments of a world beyond comprehension, of something they should not have seen, yet could not unsee. The photograph survives as a portal, a record of the sinister past, and a chilling testament to the power of observation. It is proof that dark history, disturbing images, and unsettling events do not always remain in the past. They can persist, hidden in plain sight, in shadows, whispers, and silver halide. The village may be lost in time, but its echoes endure, carried through the photograph, the children, and the secrets of families who knew too much. The photograph endures. Over a century has passed, yet it retains a strange potency, a pull that draws viewers in and refuses to release them. At first glance, it is a simple image, children smiling in a sunlit yard. But as we have uncovered, it is anything but simple. Every detail, every gesture, every shadow tells a story of hidden truths, unseen forces, and secrets that generations have struggled to conceal. The children's smiles are the most haunting feature. They are smiles that belong to innocence, yet layered with awareness. They are masks, shields, and acknowledgments all at once. They indicate a recognition of something older, something patient, something that watches from just beyond human perception. In that one frame, captured in 1913, a boundary was crossed. The ordinary and the extraordinary converged, leaving traces that cannot be erased. The object beside them remains unidentified, yet its presence is undeniable. Scholars, historians, and paranormal investigators have debated its nature for decades. Some claim it is an artifact of forgotten rituals. Others, a remnant of post-mortem practices or symbolic magic. A few suggest it is something beyond comprehension, a conduit between the living and the unseen, a focus for forces that exist outside the constraints of time and space. Regardless of what it is, the children acknowledged it. Their recognition, subtle yet undeniable, became immortalized in silver halide, preserved for generations to study and fear. The village itself has vanished, lost to time, yet its echoes remain. Forgotten families, hidden histories, whispers in the dark, they all survive within the photograph. The unsettling history of vanished children, strange families, and the forbidden language persists as a silent testament. Objects move without touch. Shadows bend unnaturally. Whispers, faint and fleeting, echo in the minds of those who dare to study the image too closely. The legacy of 1913 is not contained within a single village. It travels, it lingers, and it waits. The photograph serves as a reminder that history is not always linear, that innocence can coexist with awareness of forces beyond comprehension. The families who raised the children knew this, carefully teaching them gestures, glances, and secrets to navigate a world that was not entirely their own. They hid knowledge in journals, coded messages, and whispered warnings. The photograph, once private, has become a public conduit, a link to truths the world is rarely meant to witness. Modern observers, too, are affected. Scholars have reported chills, sensations of being watched, and even fleeting whispers when examining the image. The shadows seem to shift. The children's eyes appear to follow the viewer across the room. Some say that prolonged attention can lead to visions. Glimpses of the object from angles unseen, faint shapes hovering in peripheral vision, or fleeting impressions of movement just beyond recognition. The photograph is no longer passive. It is an active document of history, memory, and something far older, far darker than we can fully comprehend. The smile that shouldn't exist, the object that defies explanation, the unseen forces acknowledged by children over a century ago, all converge in this single frame. Forgotten events, disturbing images, and chilling secrets are interwoven into a silent narrative that whispers to anyone who dares look too long. The children's smiles are not invitations, they are warnings. They remind us that some truths are preserved not in words, but in glances, gestures, and the quiet acknowledgement of what should not be seen. Perhaps the greatest horror is not the object itself, nor the unseen forces, nor even the vanished children. It is the realization that the photograph allows a moment to persist indefinitely, that a single frame can capture something beyond time, and that these moments, once witnessed, cannot be unlearned. Every viewing of the image connects the observer to the legacy of the village, to the children, and to the sinister past that continues to linger in the shadows. And yet, the photograph is mesmerizing. Its beauty is inseparable from its horror. The children's expressions draw us in, encouraging us to study every detail, every anomaly, every unsettling element. Each glance is a reminder that history can be both alluring and terrifying, that innocence can mask understanding of things too dark for ordinary life, and that some images carry more than memory, they carry presence. So, when you look at the photograph, remember this: the smiles are not innocent, they are aware. They know, and they wait. They wait for the observer to notice, to acknowledge, and perhaps to understand a truth that has endured for more than a century. That some things are meant to remain hidden, yet when seen, they cannot be unseen. As the light fades and shadows lengthen, the photograph continues to speak, silently, persistently, unnervingly. Its legacy is not just a story of children, objects, or vanished villages. It is a reminder that the past is alive in ways we rarely recognize, that dark history continues to whisper, and that some smiles are never just smiles at all.